Hello everyone, it's Chris and Ashley here again. It's been several weeks since you last saw us. We've been busy doing things such as exams. We've both actually finished a uni exam and so here we are again. How you doing, Ashley?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. How you doing? Okay.
Hot and sweaty. So if
It is
anyone
very hot.
sees me getting kind of sweaty, we apologise in advance. It's probably the hottest day, would you say, in England of the whole year. So the question today is, does science disprove God?
Yeah. We should also probably say that we have already tried to record a video of this,
Quiet.
a podcast of this, but the audio wasn't sounding great. So we're actually doing the whole conversation again. So we'll just cover our back straight away if we say anything that we assume you already know or
Or we
something like
sound a little bit robotic because we're
that.
saying it
Robotic.
for the second time. Like, I
Yeah.
know it's hot and it's second conversation, but here we are. So
Yeah.
let's give it a shot.
Great.
So does science disprove God, Ashley? Yes or no?
No, honestly.
Okay,
I
well,
actually-
it was a good
actually had
podcast
to
this
think
week.
about that because of the heat. Actually, I almost said
It's like, if you're saying yes, I'm like, I'm gonna find another person to do this podcast with.
yeah, that would be quite a short one. No, I don't think science. I don't think science does disprove God. I think ultimately, I guess it's a point we'll come back to quite a lot if it's anything like the last conversation we had. Science ultimately looks at the material world, the world that is perceived by the five senses, and God is spirit, immaterial being, and supernatural, outside of nature. So it's out. He's already outside of the stretch of science. So science can't really tell us. Can't really say that much about God and the nature of God. It can either prove or disprove really the reality of God, in my opinion. What about you? Anything to add?
Lots more to add, I'm sure, but as like a beginning intro, yes, I would definitely agree to all of that. I think like for so many young people today, there's just like a feeling that if you want to like understand life and understand reality, science is your best bet. Well, in fact, it's your only bet.
Yeah.
Because to be unscientific is actually to understand reality. So it's all about science. And I think that kind of mindset about science is not only unscientific, but it precisely raises some of the issues that you're touching on. And I think I don't know what it's like else in every country around the world, but in Western Europe and in America, we're seeing religion decline. You know, even as relatively to young adults, not relatively, it's true. You know, young adults talking about this, like we're in the minority because most people are just getting on with their life, going to work, and just thinking like, yeah, faith and religion are like almost a superstition. There's barely any difference between superstition and religion.
Yeah.
And meanwhile there's this science thing, which it's almost like just a label, you know, science. You know, when there's actually all kinds of different sciences, but just science is figuring out what we're doing here with the meaning of life. Even maybe some people have that expectation, and that if science doesn't have all the answers to the questions now, then it will do maybe a bit later on. So meanwhile, I'm just going to get on with life and just assume that God isn't real, religion is all false, and I'd rather believe in something more concrete than just, you know, some kind of spaghetti monster in the sky or tooth fairy or a personal being that, you know, who loves you and speaks to you and, you know.
Right. Yeah, I think as well it might be worth. I think you're right. That is a common belief, and it's built upon the premise that science is a sort of solid rock, quite consistent rock to base yourself on, and it's the way to be a sort of to live in truth and reality rather than in superstition, like you say. But that premise that science is a solid rock isn't really 100% fair assumption to make, considering science is probably one of the most rapidly changing fields academic fields there are. Theories get proposed and disproved all the time, consistently. So there'll probably be, now I'm not a scientist, but there'll probably be theories that are around now that we believe quite strongly, that maybe give it another 200 years or so, they'll, something else will be believed on the same issue, and the thing we believe will be disproved. So it's a false assumption to believe, I think, that science has got is saying something very clear and consistent when it isn't. And just like any other academic fields, science, it's not like science is unanimous on all subjects. Science has got different views on different subjects. Individual scientists believe different things. And I think as well, as you look into, again, with others, same with things like theology as well, when you look into science more, you end up getting more questions rather than necessarily more answers. So it's not necessarily the all-answering, all-knowing subject that people, I think, attribute to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, again, what you're touching upon, to keep talking about what you're touching upon, is scientism. It's this kind of like mysterious religion, almost, this belief system, this, I guess ideology is the more accurate term. It's a certain way of viewing science and looking at science as if it has all the answers, when any scientist will tell you, like, we don't have all the answers, and that's why we do science, to find more of the answers. And even, well, most of the times you find an answer, you have like a million more questions as well, so it's not like case closed.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think that is definitely the prevailing attitude, that science has all the answers, or at least will one day have all the answers. But I just believe, actually, that's maybe just naive. I don't even think at t equals infinity, so time being infinite, and we're doing science for all that time, that we would ever find all the answers. I do not believe it's in the domain of science to have all the answers. And I don't think science itself makes that claim. So when people come out with science with this ideology, it's ironically unscientific, and it's putting you're imposing your own views, your own ideologies, your own beliefs even onto science. And I think that is predominantly how the S word, science, is used by maybe the average Joe today, who doesn't believe in God, or maybe is just agnostic, or doesn't even care, but sort of just like disregards religion as this kind of like, it was good for your grandparents maybe, but in this, at least in this generation, like, we should know better by now, and we should believe in myth.
Yeah, ironically, I think that view of that scientism is sort of religious as in itself, as you pointed out. It is this sort of thing that science is the traditional attributes to God are things like omnipotence, omnibenevolence doesn't really work, but in some cases I guess it does, and omnipresence in a sense as well. Like, science often gets attributed with the same sort of characteristics, which, according to somebody who would fit into a scientism category, that's quite a religious sort of way of looking at it. So it does become religious in and of itself. But yeah, it is very prominent. I guess to spell it out more clearly, it's this idea that everything, all of reality, can be perceived by our five senses, and nothing exists outside of what we perceive by our five senses. Therefore, anything like religion is false. Any sort of belief in the paranormal is all disregarded. But as well, I think other problems come into it when you start thinking of, well, there are clearly things that we believe as humans to exist that are immaterial. So, for example, the moral good, like morality, we all sort of subscribe to this understanding that there is good and evil, and we have to actually live in accordance with the good. That's why we have justice systems. We believe that when people go against this, this sort of moral code that there should be consequences for it. Now, you cannot find whether something is morally good or bad through the scientific method, through looking at, the physical world. It's an immaterial reality, morality. And there's other things as well, for example, like the nature of beauty. You can't look through a microscope and say, this is a characteristic of beauty and this will be seen as as beautiful by different people. That's another one. Even reason itself, the whole idea of human reason can't. In the scientific world, reason is just a random combination of atoms going on your head. So the question is, well, if you're a scientist, a scientismist, or an atheist, well, why trust your reason? Because it's just a random combination of atoms. So lots of things seem to fall out of place when you stretch science over areas that it shouldn't really be talking about. And it can happen with other subjects as well. You can put people have put religious issues over scientific issues. For example, you get like fundamentalists, for example, who will and I'm not saying for or against on this issue, but I think the notion that you look to the Bible to explain to you scientific realities doesn't really make sense, because that's not what the Bible's for. Like when Jesus says that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, you don't have to take that you shouldn't take that as scientific fact as a Christian, because scientifically it's not true and it's not the point that he's making. So I think that's the fundamental issue, is when you use academic areas over different academic fields where they're not needed, if that makes sense. Yeah,
it's an imbalance.
Yeah.
And bad things happen when things are imbalanced. To put it in very basic terms, that's exactly how I could characterize what you're saying. Yeah, it's a good point. I think I like some of the things you raise about like beauty, for example. You can't, I know it's a subjective thing, but then how science doesn't, in terms of like, well, let's just backtrack. Like, what is science? That is a good question. Part of science is the mechanism to which we understand things and come to know things, and that is methodological naturalism. It's the assumption that we're going to look at this for a natural explanation for what's happening and then study it under those terms. Like I'm saying, I think some people have taken that method and made it an ideology, or like a whole belief system, a lifestyle. Okay, science operates this way, so therefore this is how the world operates. I'm like, no, that's just how science operates, because science works in that domain. There's literally no scientific reason for you to extrapolate that into your whole belief system about life. The materialism and naturalism, like, they're just assumptions that I think most people make. But science is methodological naturalism, so you can't look at beauty down a telescope or read it off a dial and be like, oh, it's hit the beauty dial, it must be beautiful, or it must have some kind of virtue that we tend to gravitate towards as humans. So I think there are definitely philosophical questions there that are interesting. You mentioned human reason as well. There's quite a popular philosopher called Ed Feser, who talks about how there are certain aspects of the mind that indicate that it's immaterial. And the three things he really focuses on is intentionality, consciousness, and rationality. So you mentioned the reason thing, which I think is really interesting. Like, intentionality being you think about things. Like, so if I think about the Eiffel Tower, my thoughts are directed at the Eiffel Tower. Right. So that's intentionality. And even like plants, for example, have a basic intentionality, because they'll move towards the sun when they do photosynthesis. So even a very, very, very foundational way, even plants have intentionality. And obviously animals do as well. But then we get to consciousness. Consciousness, I would define it as being aware of the external environment, but also the internal things going on. Having this awareness of being. A plant doesn't have consciousness. A plant isn't aware of its own existence, at least that we know of. But like, and a dog, maybe, like a dog in a very primitive level. But then when you look at the difference between dogs and humans, if if it is just methodological naturalism, which is going to distinguish between the difference, well, all you can look at is the neurons firing, as you've mentioned, or whatever. But there's such a clear difference between the two that, and if we are just both purely 100% material, well, the only explanation then you can have is that, oh, well, their brains just aren't as well developed, or the, you know, it just doesn't quite work as well. But then you're like, well, look at elephants' brains. They're even bigger than our brains, but yet they don't do the things we do. So maybe we just have a more compact brain that's more efficient and better designed or something. But from like a subjective opinion, I just look at the gulf between animals and humans when it comes to consciousness. And I don't think science can fully explain all that using methodological naturalism. There are some things, some facts that are above and beyond the material facts. So I don't think science can even disprove the human soul, let alone disprove God. It's just not really what it's intended to do. Right.
I think as well, I heard, and this might be an absolute load of rubbish as argument, but I don't know enough about neuroscience to be able to affirm or deny, but I find it interesting anyway. Very simple argument. But it tells a story of this man who is on an operating table having brain surgery, and one of the surgeons touches like a nerve or something in the brain. Obviously, we're very careful, and his arm moves, and the man says, "I didn't do that." So the question is, well, who is the I in that situation? It seems to point to something, because if there is no soul, if there is no immaterial part of humans, then it would be silly to say I didn't do that, because it would just be him doing it. You know, it's a one mechanism. Whereas this man obviously acknowledged that it wasn't him, it wasn't his, whatever he's referring to, it wasn't his, you know, innate self that actually moved his arm. So it's sort of it's interesting. It's like, well, what is the I in that situation? I think from a supernaturalist perspective, which is just the opposite of naturalism, that we believe that there is things that exist beyond the five senses. I think from a supernaturalist perspective, that is totally reconcilable with the soul, really. But it was interesting, I thought, anyway, nonetheless.
Definitely, it's very fascinating. I read an article which I'll try and link in the description, from a neuroscientist who talked about, I'm going to paraphrase the article, so if someone reads it after I've quoted it and I've got it a little bit wrong, you know, I take that into consideration. So yeah, basically I get this whole part wrong. The study, according to this article, which I'll link in the description, follows Benjamin Libet's experiment. Libet began by choosing a very simple thought, the decision to press a button. He measured the timing of the participant's decision to press the button and the timing of the brainwave related to that decision. He found that the conscious decision to push the button was preceded by about half a second by a brainwave. Then, a half second later, the subject became aware of his decision. It appeared at first that the subjects were not free. Their brains made the decision to push the button and they simply followed it. But he then asked his subjects to veto their decision immediately after they made it, i.e. to not push the button after all. Again, the first brainwave appeared a half second before the conscious awareness of the decision to push the button, but Libet found that the veto, he called it free won't, had no brainwave corresponding to it. The brain then has activity that corresponds to a pre-conscious urge to do something, but we are free to veto or accept this urge. The motives are material, but the veto, and implicitly the acceptance, is an immaterial act of the will. That's the kind of nuts and bolts of it. But there are way more arguments. I mean, I know we're touching upon the human soul at the moment, but in a way I think God's existence and the human soul's existence are very linked to each other, because they refute naturalism, they refute materialism, they even refute scientism. And so that question of, does science disprove God, you realize that, well, no, it can't even disprove the human soul, for example, given its whole constraints. I'll share like one quick thing with you actually about one more argument for the immateriality of the mind, is that, and hold with me here for a second, it's a three-step syllogism. Formal thought processes have an unambiguous conceptual content, e.g., 2 + 2 = 4. That's a formal thought process. And I know exactly what that means. It's 2 + 2 = 4.
Right.
There's no ambiguity to there. I'm trying to think of the second step of the syllogism now. I can't quite remember the syllogism. I've completely forgotten it. But the basic point, though, is that material things do not have unambiguous conceptual content.
Right.
So all material things do not have this thing, but our formal thought processes do have this thing. Therefore, our formal thought processes cannot be material. That's basically the syllogism. I kind of remembered it. Because, for example, a triangle, if I drew a triangle on a piece of paper, you could interpret that in many different ways. There's nothing fundamental about my drawing of a triangle which would unambiguously tell you what it is. But yet, if our mind is exactly the same thing as all material things, likewise, it shouldn't be able to explain unambiguous thought processes. There should be an indeterminacy of meaning where we don't fully understand it. Because, for example, my triangle on a piece of paper, it could be a pizza slice, it could be the whole concept of triangles as a whole. You just don't fully know what it is. So if that's all our mind is material things in that whole domain, it doesn't quite fit. So that's just another argument. Ed Fazer talks about this, and again, I'll link to the video where he talks about the arguments for the immateriality of the mind, and you can have someone much more qualified and much better explain it. So, but I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, definitely. I think as well, sort of adding to that, I think a big issue with scientism is that it rests on a set of assumptions that it can't prove itself. It sort of assumes as it's trying to prove it, or even assumes what it's trying to prove. So, like, and again, I think there's a Christian philosopher called William Lane Craig, who's quite well known. He talks about this, but he in debate he lists 5 different things that are immaterial but nonetheless exist, and I've mentioned 3 of them already. But another one he mentions is science itself. And this is the most ironic thing, is that science itself, the philosophy of science, isn't proven by a scientific method. It's actually proven by a set of mathematical assumptions, really. Yeah. And it rests upon those things that 2 + 2 = 4, or those sorts of things, and those truths that are immaterial truths but are nonetheless true. So science, ironically, rests on what's the best way to put it? Immaterial realities to prove the material realities.
Absolutely.
So it's illogical then to say. So as I've just said, science, which rests upon immaterial realities, proves that there is nothing apart from material reality. It's complete, complete illogicality.
Well, that links to my last point about the indeterminacy of meaning, and there can't be any unambiguous concept of content in the material domain. Well, yes, the reason science works is because of the immateriality of the mind, is because of the unambiguous thought processes that, for example, when a scientist looks at a dial, he can say it's pointing to this, and he can think and they can conceptualize things in an unambiguous way. The whole scientific enterprise kind of actually crumbles upon itself if there's no meaning to things. There's no concrete, matter-of-fact meaning to anything. I mean, this is a massive topic which philosophers, particularly in recent times, are debating more and more with each other. People are starting to wake up to this fact, and I'm giving it to you, and we're both trying to give it in very layman terms, but it's there. Go ahead and look into it. William Lane Craig, Ed Fazer, and then to sort of just then hide behind, I would say, naive assumptions that science can just disprove God or anything immaterial is quite that. It's naive, and
it's not in the domain of the material.
Exactly.
It's just not. Sorry, it's not the domain of the
Exactly.
immaterial.
It's a misunderstanding of science. It's an unscientific rendering of science. In fact,
Totally.
I've actually just brought up the Wikipedia definition of scientism. So I'll just read it. This is Wikipedia. Scientism is the promotion of science as the best or only objective means by which society should determine normative and epistemological values. Which I think that is Western Europe and the Western world in general in a nutshell.
Well, this is the funny thing. I think you're right in saying that's the Western world in a sense. It's the Western world in terms of its belief, in terms of its explicit belief. The explicit confessions of faith, if you want to use religious terminology. It's the thing that people would, by and large, in the Euro-American world, really would typically say that they agree with. But in practicality, it's not actually what they live as if is true. So, there's a huge sense of, even right now, we've had all these issues on racism coming out at the minute. There's a clearly a big, no matter what your position is on this particular issue, there's clearly a huge demand for justice in society. So that's again is appearing to the, to the moral code, which is immaterial reality. So that doesn't really line up with scientism. So that's one. And as I've alluded to earlier, like beauty and even science itself is, rest on immaterial truths. So it's strange. It's what people would confess to believing, but it's not what they actually live by. They don't live by those principles. They live by some sort of moral code, and they demand justice when something breaks that code, and rightly so. But it doesn't. That does not line up with scientism whatsoever. Because what is morality? You can't look at it through a microscope. So
and even if they said it was a social construct, that doesn't quite get away from the issue, doesn't it?
No. If it's there's so many different ways you can people will explain it away. A lot of people say it's through survival of the fittest and evolutionary, evolutionary biology, but that's just not true. Which essentially says survival of the fittest, but there's lots of things that we could do to help us survive as a human race or to prosper more, which would be clearly immoral. For example, Nazi Germany performed tests on disabled people because they weren't going to contribute to the they assumed they would not contribute to the financial economy of the country. But that's clearly immoral. That's clearly really wrong. Or to terminate different to kill different people based on their intellectual ability or their value to society. It's just clearly wrong. So even though these things would help us in terms of survival and prospering, maybe from a financial perspective, they're clearly wrong. So
we just intuitively know deep down that it's wrong.
Yeah, and I've heard Marxism will say that that morality came from the upper class to suppress the working class. That's what the Marxism says. But again, that's a bit unfair because again, like loads and loads of social justice campaigns and throughout history, not just in recent times, have always been to defend the working class and poor people in society. I mean, just take a look at the New Testament. It's clearly in favour of. It's clearly offering help to the poorer people of society, more so actually than probably anybody. That's the greatest focus of Jesus' teaching is the poor, arguably. So that doesn't make sense either. So it can't simply be put down to a atheist / scientism theory. Morality is clearly a transcendent constant that, for whatever reason, for some reason, all humans, we are born with an understanding that is true, no matter how we feel. And some people, and this is the other argument I hear a lot with morality, is some people say, well, the sort of relativism thing, well, it could be fair in this country, but it's not fair, it's not right in this country.
Right, yeah.
So but that becomes, that falls apart when you use an example. So let's say like murder, right? So or cannibalism, probably a better example. In some cultures,
You hungry, Ash?
cannibalism. no, too hot. In some countries, cannibalism has been practiced in the past, and I think even today in some tribes.
I know, even in England, in some places, unfortunately.
Really? Blimey.
I'm joking.
Okay.
I'm joking. Sorry.
What? I don't know. We've seen what's it called? Britain's Darkest Taboo or something. That probably has happened, you know.
Yeah, please, someone watching this, please don't Google that. Although I know now you will Google that because I've said it, so I'm just not going to say anything now.
Yeah, but anyway, you cannot say if it's wrong. Would you really So if you're saying it's right for them, but it's wrong for us, that's what some people say. It's just a cultural construct. Okay, so are you honestly saying that in that culture, cannibalism is fine? If you went over to that culture, you would be totally fine with cannibalism taking place,
even if it was like the culturally defined. It was okay in that culture. Socially, it's okay.
What about if you were the person that got eaten? What would you say to that?
Yeah,
would you
say, mate?
Because I would be very surprised if the person argued simply that they just didn't want to be hurt. I assume they'd appeal to the morality that there's a transcendent thing that this is wrong.
I think so. That is a good point.
And I think it's fair. It's like morality is a constant that no human being can really alter. It's just something that exists whether you like it or not.
Is it not more fair to say some aspects of morality are unalterable and fixed? Because there are some. Surely there are some things that do change from a cultural standpoint.
Right, minor things like different, cultural etiquette and politeness and things like that, and certain marks in certain countries don't do in other places. Terrible example, but I don't know if this is true. It'll be absolute rubbish. But I heard when I was young, I've heard at some point that in Japan it's common to not leave your to leave a bit of your food on your plate to say like it's deemed as polite because you're saying that you've been filled up with the you've been fed properly. Mm-hmm. Whereas in this country it's more polite if you finish your plate because it's suggesting that you enjoyed the food. So moral's quite a strong word. I don't know if morality and politeness coincide, so it's not really the best
it's
example.
So immoral if you don't finish your plate of food. Maybe it is.
But the point is the point is there is cultural differences like that. But when it comes to big things like murder or sexual violence or anything like that,
exactly,
or sexual morality in general,
like say I was driving one day and I ran over someone's grandma. You can't just say like, Chris, that was so unproductive for the benefit of our society.
Yeah.
Like, of course, no one says that.
Yeah.
So I'm not claiming they would say that, but logically, what more would you have to say? Chris, that was really rude. Or Chris, that was socially unacceptable. Or culturally, that made me feel, uncomfortable. Yeah, there's something in us, and despite the fact I'm explaining this quite poorly, there's something in us that wants to say that's wrong. That was even evil if I meant it deliberately. That was an evil act of me to run over your grandmother, which I'd agree with you. It is especially if I'd premeditated it. We want that to be true. So what is, if it's not true, why is it all humans want it to be true? And what's wrong with us if we all have this delusional desire for right and wrong to be real constructs? Right,
exactly. And what is it somebody's actually saying when they say that's wrong? What are they saying? I think they're saying something about what you're doing in that act is out of line with some sort of we're trying not to use too much explicitly religious language at this point, but outside of what you're supposed to be doing, or out of line of what your purpose is. In fact, it's not only that; it actually is it's the opposite of that. It's in contradiction to, and it's stopping something purposeful. So imagine straight away, you're using some sort of theistic terminology straight away. It's certainly not scientism. It's certainly not the only thing that exists. The only thing that exists is the material, because that's clearly that clearly isn't true. So in that example. So how about this then, Chris? I'll pose a question that I often hear from people.
Okay.
Is they'll say, just because you can prove that morality, is if you would agree with us up to this point, if I accept that morality is non-natural, is non-material, and that it's transcendent, why do I suddenly have to believe that doesn't prove that God exists? What would you have to? And obviously, we don't want to get into in this episode into arguments with God's existence, but I don't know, what would you say to somebody that says that?
I would say it might not definitively prove it, but it leads, the evidence would point in that direction, that it would be some kind of supreme being. And yes, I'm not saying it's Jesus or Buddha or whatever, who, doesn't lead you down that far at all, but the evidence would suggest that there is some kind of moral lawgiver, because someone who is all-knowing and all-loving, and so therefore, there's some kind of yardstick to measure against between what's right and what's wrong. Because otherwise, like, if I call something wrong or evil, what am I comparing it to? These are all comparisons, really, because we have things that are good and things that are bad. So we know things that are bad by things that are good by comparing them to what should be, what is right, what is good. If all the comparisons are completely subjective, and you like, I run over your grandmother, to use that example again, and you say that's wrong, well, it might be wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. Like, what are you comparing it to? Like, if our definition is different, if our yardstick is different, if our measuring ruler is different, then I would be like, no, listen, mate, in my world, in my morality, running over grandmas is perfectly acceptable. Like, I don't know what kind of yardstick I'm going off. Maybe I had a terrible upbringing, and that was just what I was used to. So my frame of reference was kind of normal behavior. So that's just what I did. But we don't act like that, do we? That's what you're saying. Fundamentally, none of us act that way.
Because we don't believe it, I think, fundamentally.
Yeah, so what is it that our gut seems to be pointing towards when we want evil to be true and we want goodness to be true constructs? What is it that we intuitively seem to be projecting towards? Well, I would say it's certainly a yardstick of some kind, but it's a yardstick that can only really exist in a theistic model. So I'd say the evidence points in that direction.
Yeah, there's certainly lots of interesting points you raise. I think the main point you make there is an important one to in this discussion between naturalists and supernaturalists. Really is we're not saying from what we said, therefore Christianity is true, or therefore Catholicism is true, or therefore anything like that specific. We're saying, well, no, this is step one. And you may reject step 2, you may reject step 3, but it's certainly it puts you in a direction to believe, at least at this point, I think, that there exists something beyond the material.
Yeah.
And that, so I think that's. Actually, I was going to pick up something else from what you said now, but I can't quite remember. It was about saying something and acting in accordance with it. I find this quite like an interesting dynamic, because I think what we're seeing in culture is effectively, in layman's terms, people subconsciously picking and choosing, really. I think what it is, it's when you denounce God, you effectively remove a lot of responsibility from your life. And similarly, when you accept theism, or accept some sort of purpose to your life, you take on responsibility, and that lack of responsibility means that there's certain things you can sort of get away with. You could basically live a more of a hedonistic lifestyle, which obviously has its appeals in the short run, at least, probably not in the long run. In the short run it does. But yet when it comes to things like things that are so high up on our sort of justice radar, like murder, or at the minute, racism and these sorts of things, people can't help but demand justice for it. So it's like we're not willing to. People aren't willing to take the scientism to all the way to the logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting. It's like you get people like Dawkins saying, "Well, why don't we just chuck out religion?" And I've heard people like Jordan Peterson saying, "Well, if you chuck taking like religion and Christianity out of Western society is like taking the engine out of the car and expecting it to still move. It just won't work.
Yeah.
We're so predicated on that as a foundation. Whether you believe it or not, we're so predicated on that, and we're so reliant on that culture, on those sort of Judeo-Christian values that you can't just get rid of it. So I find that really interesting dynamic, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 50 or so years in the Western world, where will we see more logical conclusions? Oh,
so you're saying in 50 years, what will the case be?
Yeah, it'll be interesting, because I think over time as well, what tends to happen is you get more logical conclusions coming through. So, for example, obviously we know more about Protestantism, so just dive into that field very quickly. You get the idea of Luther, sola scriptura, that everything you need comes from the Bible. And Luther himself still held to things that aren't explicitly in the Bible, things like infant baptism.
Yeah, he didn't take it far enough for some people in later generations.
Yeah,
the logical implications.
Exactly. But the later generation said, no, it's not in the Bible. We don't believe. So I wonder. I wonder, and it might not be true, but I do wonder if you see logical conclusions over time. And if we're completely honest, this sort of naturalism isn't that modern, really. It's taken a sort of big increase in the 20th century, but more towards the mid to the late 20th century, not really from the beginning. So in this country, at least, it's fairly recent. So are we going to see the logical implications of it going into the next 50 to 100 years more? And is that going to affect things like our justice system and other aspects as well? I don't know. I do wonder. It'd be interesting.
Well, I think the scientism and naturalism is a contradictory belief system. And I think we're seeing contradictions in the justice systems, in the law, in what's been legislated in the last 15 years. There are contradictory notions that if you look into it and maybe think about it a bit deeper, you start to realize that, wait a minute, this is really not as coherent as you just might assume it to be. I will raise it, just one example, so it's concrete, but by doing so, I really don't mean any offense to anybody, but it's just worth saying. We have, I know YouTube picks up on whatever you say, so I'm trying to like, okay. So, the LGBT movement, for example, the T at the end, and feminism, a certain type of feminism, they do not coherently, logically gel with one another necessarily. I probably don't have to explain fully why, but even J.K. Rowling recently in Twitter has got into trouble because she's a feminist. Yeah, she holds more the traditional feminist view on the issue, and the people who hold the other view disagree with her, and she's being kind of cancelled. Well, they're trying to cancel her, but she's probably too rich and maybe a bit. She doesn't care. She doesn't really care anyway. It doesn't matter if she gets cancelled. She's kind of perfectly fine. But there's a contradiction there because she seems to support the notion that we need to protect women and help women and not let them be oppressed and things like that. But at the same time being offended by or seem to have problems with the notion that one can become a woman. Because
if they're not one before.
Because does that somehow discredit women, or does it somehow hurt feminism in a way? That seems to suggest that she believes that. So that's just one example I can muster up of how even the coherency is not all that there in our current legal system and our morality as a culture. So just an example.
I guess another one. I mean, these issues are always going to be controversial, aren't they? Because they're the issues that people are fighting. That's why they're they're there, and that's why they're being raised, because they are controversial.
Sure.
And if they were simply non-controversial and they were non-controversial but logical, they wouldn't be in the system, because people would point them out and that would be it, done. But the reason they exist is because they're controversial. There's a lot of emotion tied to them. But yeah, I mean, even there's so many examples, even in the law, again, bringing up a highly contentious issue of abortion up to birth in some cases. For example, you're allowed, I believe, to legally allowed to terminate a baby up to birth if they have Down syndrome.
In the UK, at least.
In the UK, yeah. But at the same time, you're not allowed to. We don't believe in capital punishment in this country whatsoever. Now, obviously, this premise rests upon life being in the womb, which is a whole nother issue. I don't want to get into it now. But let's just assume that the moment before birth, the child is completely alive, which I think most people would agree with. I don't know everyone, but I think most people would. That just, as the woman goes into labour, that child is alive, just needs to be born. So our law allows for somebody like that to be essentially, killed, essentially. But at the same time, who's never committed any crime, yet we are against capital punishment for criminals. Now, I'm not really sure what I think about capital punishment, but I just would like to. That's another inconsistency, isn't it? I think it's we're so pro survival in some, happy to push it to the side in other areas. So that's the case where in the law, like a bit of inconsistency. So yeah, you still the ace, thought you froze. But yeah.
Yeah, I think and people might disagree with some of the specifics that we've raised, but there are other examples as well that that are quite interesting to mention. But linking back to our original question, does science disprove God? No, it seems to be the answer. And just to sort of counterbalance what we've been saying, we are not anti-science at all.
No.
If science is going to reveal the truth about something, we'll get on board with that. It's about the truth, and with nothing to fear or nothing to be afraid of by science. And it's not like we're all waiting in bated breath, for the next scientific discovery to come. And it's like, oh my goodness, I can't be a Catholic anymore because of so and so. It's like, no, if Catholicism is true, if religion is true, science should help to discover that. It's just, I think a lot of the twisted ideology around scientism has made people come to that conclusion without any actual scientific evidence for it. Because really, if one wants to debate whether science, the evidence of science, actually points to a creator, I would believe it probably does. Being a layman who's 26 and is not got a degree in physics or chemistry or biology, but just like picking up examples I've heard of, like the Big Bang, for example, seems to suggest that the universe had a beginning, which definitely
a starting point.
Well, that definitely supports cosmological arguments. So, I mean, really, I think you strip back the scientism and the ideologies, and you just look at science for what it's made to be. I don't know. Would you say, Ashley? Do you think science either way has an explanation or evidence towards God's existence or not? Do you think it's neutral on that question, or do you think it points in that direction or not? Doesn't point in that direction? What are your personal thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's different questions you need to ask. I think there's certain scientific things that you can test by scientific method in a specific way. For example, you can test whether a blade of grass is a blade of grass by looking into its biological substance, and you can get to you can say, yes, there's evidence that the grass exists in that sense. You can't do the same thing with God. You can't go to God and be like,
sure,
yes, here's a bit of God. This is it, because God is immaterial. So that
but inductively.
But yes,
is there any inductive evidence?
Yes, yeah. So you just mentioned the point of the Big Bang and this sort of there seems to be evidence that the universe is expanding through lots of different, I believe that's fairly commonly believed now. But again, I'm no scientist, but that's what I believe, I understand to be the case. So that being said, especially with the Big Bang Theory, that suggests that if the universe is doing this, and if you rewind it, there was a point when it was this, which suggests that there was a beginning, and therefore a beginning to time, and a beginning to matter and material. So, yes, you start to ask things, okay, well, what caused that? Could it just do it itself? Well, we know that in nature, things don't just spring into existence. We know that everything has a cause in nature. So therefore, the cause of nature itself must be some sort of supernatural phenomenon. So again, we'll sort of go into the next video a little bit now, but I guess in that sense, you can make arguments from science. You say, well, that's the evidence says that there was a beginning, so what then do you do? So at that point, I think this is worth talking about. You have to bring in philosophy. Philosophy has to be the tool at which you oversee these different academic subjects. So science tells you, okay, there was a beginning. That's what science tells you. Philosophy then can take you from there to believing that there is a God.
Yeah.
And I think that is the issue that we have. And we don't just see it in science. We've seen it in, and I mentioned it earlier, in religion, different religious groups that people have used the biblical texts and religious beliefs, and they've stretched all of that material all over even the scientific world. And science has done the same thing back to religion. It seems to be this battle that's happened in the last 200 years or so. And the basic issue with these views is that it extracts philosophy out of the discussion completely. So to go with the religious example, like I mentioned earlier, that Jesus saying the mustard seed is the smallest seed, and science saying, well, no, it isn't. The religious fundamentalist the Christian fundamentalist would have to say, deny science, say, no, Jesus says this, it's wrong, and then just disregard science. Whereas philosophy will say, okay, well, what did Jesus mean by when he said that? What was he trying to get at? What was his point? What is the point of the biblical text? That's a philosophical question that you ask. Science also, science can tell us, like I just said, that there was a beginning. But then a philosophical question is, okay, well, what does that tell us? So the philosophical question is always, well, how does that inform us? So I guess the academic areas are almost, to use some sort of analogy, the academic areas are like tools, and the philosophy is like the brain to the person. That's how we understand it. I don't know if that makes sense. But I think when you get rid of philosophy, which interestingly you see at the same time in Christianity, in certain evangelical Protestant movements, fundamentalist movements, you see the same thing happen at the same time in the scientific world.
Yeah, there's two extremes, isn't there?
Exactly. Yeah. So they're actually quite similar.
Yeah.
The fundamental evangelical Protestant Christian, and
who only takes the Bible alone
only takes the Bible alone on every matter of anything.
Everything, yeah.
It's in fact, and the scientist that says, the scientismist, the naturalist, for a better word, who says that science can tell us everything about everything. It's just the same thing, but using different things. So I find it interesting that they both started to rise at the same time, sort of 19th, 20th century.
Why do you think that is? Like, what is the root that made those two offshoots, scientism and religious fundamentalism, a thing? What is that beginning stage? I
mean, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
I guess you can only really speculate, but
we'll go on.
It's obviously linked to the Enlightenment, and I don't know. I guess as well, the Enlightenment, what you see and this is the ironic thing, because the Enlightenment, even though it chucked out philosophy in some ways, not every way, but in some cases, in its extreme, was a philosophy in and of itself. For example, scientism is a philosophy.
Yeah,
right?
well, I was going to raise that point before, but I was like, no, I wanted you to make the point. But yes, it's worth saying you can't escape philosophy, even if you give lip service to not doing it. That's the philosophy. Not doing philosophy is a philosophy. So yeah.
Right. Where was I? How did science?
That route. What is that route? It seems to these two divergent paths of scientism and religious fundamentalism. I can imagine some people will be like, "What?
Yeah.
Like you guys are saying like we're akin to religious fundamentalists?" I'm like,
right.
Only in some levels.
In some ways.
Hear us out.
So I think it's this, and again, this ironic Enlightenment philosophy that which is true can be comprehended and fully understood by the human intellect. I think that's the guiding principle. So, the science, the naturalist, or the atheist will say, I only believe something if I can understand it. If there's evidence for it, I understand it, I'll only accept it. The fundamentalist will also do the same thing. I only accept theological truths if I can understand them and grapple them. That's why in Christianity you get a rise in things like Calvinism, a very mechanical form of Christianity that seeks to explain exactly how God's justice, His mercy, His grace fit together, how that happens. Whereas I think Christianity historically has always embraced mysticism, a sort of understanding that there are some things that, although are reasonable to believe, they are not graspable. You cannot grasp them. So, for example, it is reasonable to believe that God is three persons in one, but that doesn't mean that we can grasp how the Trinity actually functions. So, and I think scientism and religious fundamentalism do the same thing. So I don't know how. I guess you can keep going back. Well, how did that philosophy start? But I do think that is an Enlightenment philosophy that seeks to rationalize everything.
No, yeah. Well, going back to that question about what is the root of this, maybe it could be the Protestant Reformation, because at that point you had a real shake-up in views, and on the one hand you can kind of interpret religion for yourself and purely from the book. So if that's your modus operandi, then the book and your interpretation of the book becomes very, very important, almost all-encompassing almost. But then at the same time, maybe as secularism increased and religion was seen as more as fairies, tales, but even in that minor stages of maybe religion was seen as myth, or maybe even true myth, but kind of mythical, or purely metaphorical or symbolic. At the same time, people started to have less confidence in it. So then both are a reaction to a philosophical current, or a change in how people perceived Christianity in particular. I'm talking about Western Europe here, and Europe in general. So I'm not speaking for Asia or whatever, or South America. But at least for Germany and France and England and Scandinavia, for example, where the Protestant Reformation was quite strong. We see these waves, these philosophical waves coming on later. So maybe they were reactions to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. So that's why you get two, I would say, extreme on either sides. And I believe our position is more of the middle ground. It's, we embrace science, we are thankful for science, and I do think it's worth mentioning the historical relationship between the church and science. I think that's a good thing to mention. I'll maybe pass on to you in a sec if you want to cover that. But we appreciate it, but we also understand its place. And we don't disregard philosophy. Our philosophy is not to disregard philosophy. It's to actually logically induce that it might exist through induction. And from science in its proper domain might be saying, but it's not just science as well, because there are other things that support our belief in God. So it's about having balance and everything being in its proper place, I think, really. And I think when you take the balance out, you get lopsided in either direction. So that would be my theory, a complete theory. I've not studied it at all, really. But that would be my theory.
I have wondered that before, and I think another thing that is interesting that would, I guess, support the hypothesis is the hypothesis that you make that the Protestant Reformation had a strong link to the secularization in general. Is that if you look at European countries where the Protestant Reformation really took hold of, they were often the first countries to sort of become secularized quite quickly.
Like which ones, for example?
So Germany, Scandinavia. In this country, we sort of have a bit of a weird way because the Church of England is sort of half Catholic, half not Catholic.
We're a bit weird.
So our secularizations happen differently. But at least in Scandinavia, I believe, is the most secular part of Europe.
Could be,
I believe that's true. And that I know Lutheranism and the Reformation really took a strong grip there. as well. Lots of Germany, like I said, Holland as well, Switzerland, quite a secular country. So these are countries that are really strongly affected by the Protestant Reformation. They were the ones that were, that were secularized pretty quick. Of course, now the countries that were less affected by the Reformation, like France and Spain and Italy, Catholic countries that remain Catholic, obviously had their own sort of secularization. But I think I'd be interested to look into it. But I wonder if it was a different sort of style of secularization, a different way it went about.
Well,
I don't know. It'd be interesting.
My wife is French, and this is how I know about it. In France, they still have holidays on feast days.
Right.
It might be very secular, but they'll have the Feast of the Immaculate Conception off work because it's the Feast of the Immaculate Conception.
Right.
Whatever that says. There we go.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So, no, go ahead, Ashley. Do you want to say something
else?
Yeah,
well, I was just wanted to mention one more thing about science. I think scientism contradicting itself. We mentioned a few different things that it assumes what it's trying to prove. But I guess the notion that everything that is true is built, everything that exists can be perceived by five senses, is an assumption that hasn't actually been proven, and it goes very circular. Because what happens is you say I only believe things that I can understand with my five senses, and then they say I'll only believe your position, your supernaturalist position, if you can scientifically show me. Which again is only the study through the five senses. So you're not even looking.
That's not fair.
Yeah, it's like you're assuming what you're trying to prove. You're saying there's no scientific evidence. If we substitute the word scientific for something like, I don't know, sensory evidence for, or material evidence for, then it's sort of, you can see it doesn't work. If you say, I'll only accept supernatural evidence if you can provide material evidence for me. It doesn't work. It's a fallacy. So I think that's important to point out, that it does contradict itself quite strongly and that's what happens when you take an academic field into a subject where it doesn't belong, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, scientism can't be proven by science, and it's like sola scriptura can't be proven by scripture.
Exactly the same. It's exactly the same thing.
A funny parallel there, isn't it? That you've been pointing out. Yeah. Because the sola scriptura again. Ironically, the Bible doesn't even teach sola scriptura. But even if it did, that would still be circular. You can't say the Bible is true because the Bible says it is. It's like, well, no, that doesn't mean it's true. You have to look to exterior evidence for it. Yeah, absolutely. But not only I think scientism is a sloppy philosophy, but in some ways it's the death of it. Because I've been speaking to some friends, who people I really get on well with, but then we will debate this topic. People who love philosophy and then became atheist or part of the new atheist movement, who then say things like, we can't really trust philosophy. It's better just to go with what's more certain. And I'm just like, well, we can't debate now, can we? Because you're not going to accept anything I'm saying, any logical deduction or inference or anything like that. There's no point now, because you've set the standard to an impossible level, which actually you don't even enforce that same standard upon yourself. So upon that view itself. So there's really no conversation to be had anymore. Like, there's no point about philosophy because it's all suspect. And the whole miracle thing, that whole miracle side of faith is shut down too, because it's like, I might tell you about a miracle that I might have experienced, which just hypothetically, and the mindset of someone who believes in scientism would be, miracles don't happen. Mm-hmm. You tell me a miracle story. Okay, well, the reason that miracle didn't happen was because miracles don't happen. Again, even that is circular reasoning. It's not. You don't have a step in between rejecting it, which is not outside of your current framework of understanding. It's just completely self-referential. So it just shuts it down. It shuts down philosophy. It shuts down debate. I mean, I think this is where some balance might be needed, because science has so many benefits. Methodological naturalism has given us so much amazing things. And even going back to the whole immateriality of the mind topic we talked about 30 minutes ago, even that, looking at it from a purely material perspective, has given us incredible benefits functionally,
Yeah.
so we're not jettisoning all that and saying all that's, we should now do science without the methodological naturalism. We should now start thinking maybe ghosts cause things, or it just happened because it just no, the scientific domain works very well with methodological naturalism, and even the material concepts of the brain has led to all kinds of discoveries. All we're saying is that to say that's the definitive answer, case closed, is oversimplistic, maybe even naive, and it's an extreme position to take.
Yeah, for sure. And it keeps coming back to its relationship with philosophy, I think, because what you just said there, scientism, you just laid it out what it was. It is a philosophy in and of itself.
Yeah.
The philosophy that you can't use philosophy is still a philosophy, right?
Just hammer that point home.
So you can either, and it doesn't matter whether you're a fundamentalist Christian or you're a naturalist, you can either run away from this philosophy. You can't ever really escape it because you're always using it.
Yeah.
Or you can just embrace philosophy and use it where it's needed, which again philosophy is the overseer, really, in that sense. So you have to, I think, embrace it. You can't say if you chuck it out the window, you fall into so many inconsistencies.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's going to really impede your pursuit of truth.
Yes.
Whatever you understand by truth, it's going to massively impede that because you're not embracing it for what it is, and that will have impacts in all sorts of parts of your life, including, the politics in the context of your own life, but also your bigger area.
Yeah.
Things like law, justice, and anything in law when it comes to looking at evidence for crimes and stuff. It has so many impacts on so many things. There's a ripple effect, and if you embrace philosophy for what it is, then I think your pursuit of truth is going to be far more straightforward and clearer.
Definitely, and I think you'll be a happier person because you're living according to the truth. There's something meaningful. I mean, the price tag of believing in scientism and atheism and naturalism and whatever is, nihilism. You might as well just not think anything is got anything meaningful to it. There's no point for anything.
Which happened to Nietzsche as well. Nietzsche was an atheistic philosopher who is very interesting because he seems to take this naturalism to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And he ended up in a psychological asylum, a mental asylum, for the last 10 years of his life, because he just realised he genuinely believed that there was no purpose, no point to anything. And
that's depressing, isn't it?
It's extremely depressing. It's dark.
Yeah, because basically you live a short life here on Earth, but you're completely here by accident with no reason to it. And even if you say yes, but we make our own reasons, deep down you're just making them up. It's not actually real. You're just kidding yourself. That's just your little emotional crutch to make yourself feel better and maybe sleep better at night. But then you'll go through life, you'll work, or even if you want to have fun and you want to travel the world and do cool things, at the end of the day it's all pointless anyway, because you'll end up being decomposed in the ground, and that's you done. And everyone around you will forget about you eventually, and then the next generation won't even know you existed, and that's just your whole life done. And you might think, well, that means that I can sleep in on a Sunday and not go to church and play FIFA. Well, if that's nice for you, but that's the trade-off. There's literally no reason for you to exist other than the reason that you just conjure up for yourself subjectively to make yourself feel better about not having an actual reason to be alive.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think for me that's everything I was going to say. But ultimately, so going back to the question, then, sorry, I was
going to say, very, very briefly, Galileo. What happened there actually? Because that is one of the biggest things about the church. Christianity is against science. What are your thoughts on that? Just very briefly. And I know you're not an expert on that.
I'm not gonna lie. I don't know as much on this situation, so I think you should do
it. This is where I'm I asked you the question because I don't know the answer to it. I'm like, oh no. Okay, here I go. Okay. So there's a modern notion that I think it's more of a new atheist notion that science was like this unfortunate child of the medieval era, and it was trying to break free of the constraints of religion and the superstition. And it managed to surface itself up to the top, and that's when we saw the explosion of the Enlightenment. And ever since then, life has been better because we have science now. That is just not historical. And I think the mascot of that view is this guy called Galileo, who said correctly that actually it wasn't the sun that revolved around the earth, but the earth that revolved around the sun. And the new atheist tale of that narrative is that Galileo was burned alive by the Catholic Church because he was contradicting the Bible, and therefore undermining their authority to brainwash all the innocent peasants of the medieval time. And that just is not the historical fact at all. First of all, Galileo was not burnt to death. He was kept under a very comfortable arrangement of house arrest. I'm going to jump in here since I did a bit of research into this afterward. While it is true the modern atheistic narrative around Galileo is inaccurate, Galileo's correct view was slowed down by the Inquisition during his day. They believed the notion that the earth revolved around the sun, instead of the sun revolving around the earth, was heretical, insofar as it contradicted their literal view of some scriptures. This was the view of a few members of the Inquisition and some in the church hierarchy. Nonetheless, other Catholics in positions of authority were, to various levels of degree, sympathetic to Galileo. This included 2 popes of his day. A lot of the caution around Galileo was about the moral and spiritual implications Galileo's ideas would have on people. As it turns out, Galileo didn't just teach that the earth revolved around the sun, but his followers ventured into theology, and recent discoveries in the Vatican archives suggest Galileo may even have been denying Aristotle's view of matter, which may have been seen as an implicit attack on the doctrine of transubstantiation that had been articulated by the Fourth Council of the Lateran around 400 years earlier. Hence, for various complex and even political reasons, Galileo was indeed condemned to house arrest in Florence for the last 9 years of his life, and his views of heliocentrism were suppressed. The Church has since cleared Galileo of wrongdoing. Pope John Paul II said in 1992, "The error of the theologians of the time, when they maintained the centrality of the earth, was to think that our understanding of the physical world structure was, in some way, imposed by the literal sense of sacred scripture." So, there we have it. Unsurprisingly, it turns out that humans aren't generally perfect after all, and are prone to make mistakes. In fact, the Church was funding scientific enterprises. The Big Bang, like we mentioned before, was discovered by a Catholic priest. I believe it was a Catholic priest. Mm-hmm. But even before then, it was being funded by the Church. Like I've said before, we're not scared of science as if it's going to suddenly realize that our faith is a load of rubbish. We wouldn't be funding it throughout history if we were afraid of it.
I do think there are some groups that are scared of science. You do hear some the fundamentalists. You do hear things, ludicrous things said, like that the reason that we find fossils around the world that seem to suggest an old Earth was actually placed by the devil to test people's faith. I mean, that's just a conspiracy theory. There's no evidence for that at all. So either scripturally or theologically, philosophically. So those groups obviously are. But the Catholic Church's relationship with science has never been, as you've mentioned, in that way. So it shows the power of narratives, and we see it today as well, don't we? You have to read the facts and stuff, and narratives are really important to understand. Yeah, absolutely. So that's my understanding of Galileo. There might be some things wrong with that, but that's my understanding of it in a nutshell. I know it's at least more accurate than the atheist narrative of Galileo. Right. So there we are. Right. So does science disprove God? What would you say to wrap up, Chris?
No, it also doesn't disprove that there's no immaterial aspect of humanity as well. We need to see science in its proper context. Appreciate it for what it is, but keep it in its place.
Yeah.
What would be
agree with that.
Would that be sort of your sentiment?
Yeah. I would say even to ask that question is to stretch science past its own capabilities, because it's stretching it past the material, which it can't do, which by its own very nature it can't do.
Yeah.
So you're seeking to use the wrong tool. Essentially, science is not for that. You're using the wrong issue. It can't disprove God, like you say, simply because it can't even talk about the supernatural. It doesn't. It can't do that. So no, it doesn't disprove God.
All right then. So that was our second time doing this video, on like probably one of the hottest days of the year in England. So there we are.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody for listening to that. I hope you appreciated it. If you have any comments or thoughts, let us know. If you disagree with us, let us know. If you agree, let us know. Either way, we'd love to hear from you. And I think me and Ash will maybe do a bit more philosophical ones, at least as it pertains to atheism and some of the cultural topics of today. Obviously, we're not experts on these topics, but we just have a few thoughts. So hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, bye-bye. Hey guys, it's Chris here. If you liked that video and you're not already subscribed, go ahead and click this red subscribe button. You don't have to, I'm just a random guy on the internet telling you to do it, but it would help me out, to be honest, so you can if you want. Also click the bell, click all, and that will mean that every time there's a new video, you'll be notified. Okay, cheers.